All right, hello. Good afternoon. It was very interesting following on from Elliot's discussion about packaging plastics. So, although I'm at the coalface in the industry, supplying netting structures and tunnels and greenhouses, my previous iteration I was in very much in the plastic sustainability area. So. And I know that packaging in particular is a real focus of government at the moment. Today I'm going to talk not so much about packaging, but more about really about structures and about the challenges that growers are facing. So hopefully that's working. So who am I? 12 years in plastics manufacturing. Um, uh, as part of that, I worked with a company called the Tapex Group, and they were in broadacre ag and supplying a lot of plastic into the agricultural sector. And one of the key drivers of the ownership of the business was that if we're going to sell all that plastic into ag, we need to try and look for solutions at end of life. So as a consequence, they engaged me to put together a product stewardship program, both in Australia and also helping with in New Zealand. That system unfortunately no longer operates in Australia, but it is still operating in New Zealand. It's called Plasback there, and that recycles about 50% of end-of-life plastics off farms in New Zealand, which is a pretty amazing result. Still operating today. I've also done a bit of consulting. I put my hand up. I have been a consultant, no longer. A bit of consulting in that whole ag plastics area. The previous federal government engaged funded a program to really put together research and also test the viability of putting together a product stewardship scheme nationally for the agricultural sector. That was about a 2-year exercise. We did recovery trials of a variety of different plastics across the country, in particular around the Riverina, and we presented this U-Butte report to government on what the solution was. And it's one of those things with consultants. You can provide the report, but you can't actually implement it. So that is now, I'm sure, in the bottom of the minister's drawer somewhere, and hopefully that will get pulled out at some stage. But it was an interesting piece of work. I'm now the general manager of protected cropping for the Tapex Group. So in particular with our greenhouse and netting structure businesses, GreenlifeGRO and Redpath. So, environmental pressures on the berry sector. This I've used a shot here of a Spanish tunnel in Spain so that nobody can be outed on this one. I was actually there a couple of weeks ago. This is an area called Wilba, which is just to the west of Seville in Spain, and around about 6,000 hectares of tunnels there. But some of those major environmental pressures, I mean, water is obviously a key issue for growers, but also pests and disease, waste disposal, and obviously climate change is affecting various different regions and changing the environments within which we're being able to grow. I'm going to talk specifically about the waste disposal part of that, and because of the background I've just spoken about, obviously plastics is going to be the focus with that. Speaking of plastics, anybody been to this place? This is Almeria in Spain again. Again, I was there a couple of weeks ago. I'm not trying to boast about my travelling, but it was just a fascinating week looking at meeting growers and having a look at greenhouse structures. This particular region in Spain, you can see from space, 38,000 hectares of greenhouses. So that's a fair bit of plastic. So how big is that, this issue? What do we need to do? Key plastics, current solutions, future solutions. This is what I'm going to talk about. I mentioned before the program I worked on, the national plastics, agricultural plastics product stewardship program I worked on with for government. We did a whole bunch of research across the whole sector. The ag sector, 110,000 tonnes of plastic is consumed a year. So that's purchased, not necessarily meeting end of life, because some of those plastics, be it tunnel films, for instance, might have a 5 or 6 year life, down to single-use plastics, which have much shorter lives. But of that 110,000 tonnes, 74,000 tonnes of it is used in the horticultural sector. So we are by far the biggest user. And from that previous picture, as you saw of El Maria, the intensity of it is particularly concentrated in the protected cropping area. So why should we do something about it? Elliot was talking earlier about packaging plastics and pressures that are coming from there. Some of those pressures are applying to us as well as growers. But probably the biggest thing of all, I think it's the right thing to do. The business that I'm now working for, who previously engaged me as a consultant, see it as a priority. But I know that there are other areas that see it as a priority as well, not the least of which supply chain. And that includes our customers. And that's not just end of line customers, but the customers in the supermarkets, but the supermarket chains themselves. There is, I went through Lismore a few years ago after the big flood event through there, and we can see what happens to plastics when, in particular off farm, when they're not disposed of properly when you have a big flood event, because they all end up, out in the ocean, and there's plastic hanging from there were plastic hanging from trees. It was all over the place. So the environmental damage that can be caused by it, I won't talk about, because I think it's pretty much out there. But it's part of the reason why there's so much pressure coming back on to us, both as suppliers and growers, to do something about this issue. Elliot again talked about EPR schemes, so which really becomes a cost factor. I mean, that people can talk about EPR. What does it mean? It means that somebody has to pay for that end of life. One of the things that I've spent the last 12 to 15 years doing is trying to design systems that can minimise the cost, in particular to the end user. And us as a supplier, we have a obligation to help our end user try and find an end-of-life solution. But of course, there's APCO was mentioned before. There's a national plastics plan and regulation from government. Interestingly, all the research and programs that I was engaged in previously were in fact put in place by the previous federal government. The current federal government has very much turned their emphasis on packaging plastics and taken it off the ag sector, which is a shame, because we tend to, packaging plastics, which are single use, tend to be very much in everybody's face. But when it comes to things, I mentioned environmental damage before, if there isn't correct disposal, ag plastics can actually create some of the worst consequences. So something must be put in place to do about it. And it flies under the radar because it's not seen on a day-to-day basis in the big cities. Look, a few of you would have seen Elliot's speech. He talked about regulation much more. I'm not really going to go into it. I mean, a lot of the driver came from a policy from China back in 2018 when they banned. We used to send all our plastic there, where they banned the import of plastic. In some cases, it's now going to other locations, but really it led to a raft of legislation coming into place and some very bullish targets, none of which have been met, none of which really look like they're going to be met. But you know, it's the packaging being much of the emphasis, but it's going to come back and also impact us in the ag sector as well. So this is from some of the work we did from the National Agricultural Plastics Product Stewardship Scheme as to where all those plastics are going. And as you can see, if you look down the bottom, have I got a pointer on this? I don't want to mess anything up, but if you have a look at the bottom left there, horticulture is the biggest generator, in particular around piping irrigation, storage trays, and protective films. So if you look at where all of that's going, very little of it's getting recycled. A lot of it's going into some less than optimal spaces, such as burning and burying. Landfill is actually, in most cases, the best result. But again, you know, some of the work that I've done previously for Tapex in the berry sector. You've got areas like Coffs Harbour now where there's pushback from some types of plastics, such as netting, protective netting and bird netting going into council landfills. It's a pain in the ass for them because it's very fluffy, it's hard for them to compact, and there is resistance and pushback on that as well from council. So that is also going to be a touch point for us. So in the berry sector in particular, some of those key plastics that we're dealing with, we've got piping irrigation, nets and mesh, protective films I mentioned, ropes, pots and drums. They are in most cases different types of plastics that can't be dealt with separately together. They've got to be dealt with separately. And this is a fairly complicated chart. I won't, but just the main thing to say here is probably the guys who've done the best job around that are Garden City Plastics, in that they've got a return scheme for their pots, and of course it's all one stream of plastic, which is polypropylene, although some of the imported product coming in is a different plastic, and if it gets in their stream, it completely stuffs up the whole recycling. So you've really got to have the same plastic going into the same recycling scheme. So they really, and growers need to be cognizant of that if they're trying to think of an end of life for some of those plastics. Irrigation, again, some of the suppliers have put together programs to try and recover those as well. And the good thing about both the HD that's in irrigation and also the PP going into pots is that it can go straight back into the same product again. So that really is circular economy. Again, this is around recycling technologies. I won't go into it too much, but suffice to say, there's been a lot of talk about non-mechanical recycling, which is chemical-based or hydro-based recycling. Really, the main way that anything's recycled in Australia is mechanical. These other technologies, in most cases, are untested and certainly not available at scale here. So they are no panacea. The other area is the move towards biodegradable and compostable. Now, in the case of single-use plastics, and this example here shows a twine, but one of the major areas, problem areas, is mulch films, and particular, for strawberry growers. There are solutions coming out now. In fact, I was at a plant a couple of weeks ago in Seville where they're now producing, I think, around about 3,000 to 4,000 tonnes a year of compostable mulch film. So it can just be left in situ and then planted over the top of. The reason they can't mechanically recycle mulch film is because there's so much dirt, so much inorganic matter mixed up with it that no recycler in their right mind will look at it because it wears out their machinery. Another example there is a twine, and I'll out myself here. We do actually own part of a compostable twine company, but this is around trying to find solutions that are allow a product that can be recycled with green waste at end of life. So in other words, you just chop the whole lot up and you compost it together. So it gives you a really good solution coming out the other end. All of these things cost a little bit more. They're usually about double the price of the normal plastic, but it means at end of life there is a solution. Unfortunately, with most of the polymers, there isn't necessarily. We're doing a bit of work at the moment with some of our key suppliers around areas like film. We've been doing some already have a pathway. Costa at Corindi have a pathway for their tunnel film, which is being recycled, but there aren't very many mechanical recyclers with the capability in Australia at the moment. Theirs is getting sent all the way to Melbourne, and Costa Melbourne isn't just down the road. There is some more capability coming online, and we're working with some of those new recyclers now to try and find some solutions. The future, how are things looking going forward? Well, there's obviously a lot of pressure. I think it's eased with the change in federal government. We might just have an election soon, and it may well change again. But certainly, supply chain pressure is increasing. Waste costs, of course, are increasing. Practices such as burning are going to become more and more heavily enforced because clearly it's a legal practice, let alone not the most moral way of disposing of your waste. Industry stewardship, I'd love to see it happening. There's been lots of talk about it. I've been talking about it with people for 15 years and nothing's happened this year. So unless there's a little bit of push, I think, probably regulatory push, I can't see industry itself pulling a solution together any time soon. There has been a lot of investment from the previous government, and that capacity is starting to come online now. We're doing a little bit of our own stuff. This is within the Redpath and GreenlifeGRO with a product or a system called HortiCycle, and we're looking at some pathways for our customers to help them dispose of some of their waste products. But ideally, we want to try and help by putting the right solution in place with as long a life as possible. There's no way we're feeding 8 billion people without the help of plastic. I mean, there's been lots of discussion about alternatives. It really doesn't work without it. So, and our whole supply chain system has been set up to use it. We just need to find the proper end-of-life solutions around it. And that's pretty much it from me. How did I go time-wise? Nailed it. Yes, young lady. Rachel? Yes. Yeah. Okay. So that's a good question because when it comes to degradable and compostable. There's a whole continuum of between the two. You can put additives into a standard polymer, which will ensure that it breaks down into smaller and smaller particles. That is not compostable. Compostable industrially or commercially or domestically compostable means that it has completely broken down, not into microplastics, but broken down into its key elements and been absorbed into the humus. So what they're using for compostable, true compostable plastics, they're tending to use not a plastic base, but they're using a plant base to start with. So PLA is probably the one that's used the most. So it's like, you know, oils ain't oils. You've got to look at what is truly compostable. So it should be go to a state, and this is exactly what we've done with all our trials with our compostable twines, that it can be it goes back into the humus of the green waste that it's sitting amongst, and you can spread it out on the field, and it's a true compost.
Thank you.
Thanks for a pretty stimulating presentation. I was just wondering whether you've looked up into China for what they're doing there. I know they have about 3.5 million hectares of tunnel and I think 18 or 20 million hectares of mulch, and they were trying to find solutions. Have you had a look up there?
I can't say I have. I used to visit China once a year for about 20 years, and I haven't visited it since before COVID. So look, I couldn't really comment with any honesty. We used to send all our plastics there, so they clearly had a well-developed plastics recycling industry there. Whether the environmental standards were up to scratch, I don't know. But I'll give you another example. In Spain, that 38,000 hectares of plastic, and you think the Europeans are going to be all over it like a hairy dog. The Spanish, they've got like 10,000 tons worth of recycling capacity in Spain. So, hello, they're probably about 200,000 tons short of where they need to be just for ag plastics. Interestingly, our film supplier there, the guys who took us around, Armando Alvarez, recognising that, are putting together a whole plastics recycling plant right in the middle of that, the heart of that, that area of all that plastic, because they realise that it's just not sustainable. It can't go on, because what's happening to it all? It's getting buried or it's getting burned.
Well, given that, and you mentioned about burning, and asked earlier this as well.
Burns really well. If you want, was that the question?
So why don't we? So why don't you put a high-grade incinerator in and convert it to energy and do it and be honest about it, rather than letting it flutter off into the sea?
I'll send you the minister's contact details. Because you know what? Government's been talking about it here in Australia for 20 years. 20 years. So high, the calorific value of plastics is enormously high. So it's like burning oil. So really, the energy as an energy source, it's totally a sensible option. Recycling isn't necessarily the best pathway or the most cost-effective pathway, and we are. It's what I was saying before. At the very least, landfall's probably the best of the worst options, because it's largely inert when it's buried in the ground. But the worst thing you can do is have it,
But if you burn it properly, so there are other places in the world who do this.
Absolutely, and doing it now. Europeans, a lot of it will be happening in Europe. Japanese also, very big.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I just had a quick one. You mentioned that there's limited tunnel plastic recycling options in Australia, and it's particularly a challenge in Tasmania. Is there something that makes tunnel plastic more challenging to recycle compared to other plastics?
Tunnel plastic is a beautiful material to recycle because it's clear, It's thick, relatively thick, so it's 180 or 200 so it's actually a great plastic to recycle. It's just really a reflection of capacity. The problem in Tassie, you had a fairly capable recycler here who unfortunately has met the fate of many of them because it is a really tough business. They went bust a few years ago, and now if you're going to recycle anything, it's got to be shipped over to the mainland, and then you've got all that freight cost. It suddenly becomes uneconomic, and this is so really Tassie needs a recycler again. So state government, anyway, it's got to be subsidised, otherwise it's just not going to happen.
Sure. Thanks, Ed.
Okay, thank you.
Lovely. Thank you.